7,000 fan letters a week. That's the kind of adoration most actors will never even dream of. Yet, just a few years later, that same man was sleeping on a park bench in Central Park unnoticed, unprotected, and largely forgotten by the same industry that once packaged him as America's golden boy. And here's the uncomfortable question. Was this the inevitable collapse of a man who couldn't handle success, or the result of a system that built him up only to discard him once he no longer fit the brand? Welcome to Tragedy Uncovered, where we don't just talk about the rise and fall of stars, we dissect the machinery behind fame, the decisions that lead to public implosions, and the way we, as an audience, sometimes become complicit. If you haven't already, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss the truths others would rather leave buried. The story of Troy Donahue isn't just another Hollywood cautionary tale told in tidy bullet points. It's an intricate web of timing, marketing, personal weakness, and corporate expediency, a story that begins in 1936 in New York City. Born as Merle Johnson Jr., he lost his father to ALS at just 14, a blow that would leave him with a gnawing emptiness. That grief quietly set the stage for the unhealthy coping habits, drinking, mostly, that would shadow him later. He was tall, strikingly handsome, and, to industry eyes, marketable. But in a business where timing is everything, he almost lost his shot entirely. Just before a critical screen test, he was in a serious car accident. Yet fate, or perhaps sheer determination, put him in the path of Henry Wilson, the legendary Hollywood agent with a reputation for manufacturing stars as if on an assembly line. Wilson gave him the name Troy Donahue, a name that sounded like it belonged on billboards, not in the credits of minor TV roles. And with Warner Brothers behind him, the marketing machine went into overdrive. Roles in A Summer Place and various Warner-produced TV shows turned him into a teen idol almost overnight. By 1962, his fan mail was reportedly hitting 7,000 letters a week, physical proof of just how deeply he had lodged himself into America's collective daydream. But here's the problem with being a perfect image. It doesn't leave much room for being a human being. When you're young, beautiful, and marketable, studios treat you as a product. The moment sales plateau or public tastes shift, you're suddenly yesterday's news. For Troy, that shift came fast. As the 60s wore on, the clean-cut, square-jawed look fell out of fashion. Warner Brothers began to pull back on promoting him. Then came the roles that flopped, most notably My Blood Runs Cold, which tried to repackage him as a grittier, edgier actor, but the audience didn't buy it. On top of the professional misfires, his personal life began to draw headlines of the wrong kind. Marriages collapsed in under a year. Allegations from former fiancés and co-stars hinted at a darker side, accounts of volatility and poor behavior which, in the Hollywood of that era, were often smoothed over rather than investigated. Jack Warner himself reportedly intervened to keep one particularly damaging accusation out of the press. And this is where the story takes on a troubling dimension. On one hand, Troy was responsible for his choicest substance abuse, failed relationships, professional missteps. On the other, the studio system that created him was the same system that shielded him when it suited them and cut him loose when it didn't. Which matters more, the individual's flaws or the system that enabled and then abandoned him? That's the kind of question that doesn't come with a clean answer. But it's worth asking if we want to understand how fame really works. By the late 1960s, Troy's career had hit a wall. In 1968, he declared bankruptcy. That same year, while performing with the USO in Vietnam, he found himself embroiled in a public relations mess, further shrinking his professional prospects. Within a year, he was effectively homeless, spending months sleeping in Central Park. Imagine that. The man who once had teenage girls scaling the fences of his house to catch a glimpse of him, now invisible in plain sight. It's tempting to frame this as poetic justice or personal tragedy, but maybe it's both and neither. The turn came, unexpectedly, from a high school connection. Francis Ford Coppola, then riding the wave of his own success, offered Troy a small role in The Godfather Part 2. It wasn't a lead. It wasn't even a particularly memorable character, but Coppola credited him under his real name, Merle Johnson, as if to anchor the moment in reality rather than image. The paycheck, $10,000 a week, was more than just money. It was a reminder that someone still saw him as worth hiring, worth remembering. Yet the role didn't launch a full-scale comeback. Troy drifted through minor appearances in the late 70s, interspersed with more personal chaos, including another short-lived marriage. Then, in 1982, he joined Alcoholics Anonymous and stayed sober for the remaining 19 years of his life. For someone whose story had been a slow-motion collapse for over a decade, this was a rare and meaningful victory. In his later years, he reconnected with his children, maintained a stable relationship, and took occasional cameo roles, playing into the nostalgia for the golden-haired heartthrob he once was. And maybe that's the version of himself he was content to leave behind. He died in 2001 from complications following 2 heart attacks, at the age of 65. So what does this story really tell us? That talent, beauty, and timing can combine to make a star, but they can't keep someone there indefinitely. That personal demons will always find their way to the surface, no matter how carefully a studio polishes your image, or that the entertainment industry, in its hunger for the next marketable face, doesn't just forget people like consumes them. It's easy to look back and judge from a distance, but maybe the harder truth is this: the public, the press, the studios, and the stars themselves all play a role in creating these arcs from meteoric rise to very public fall. We loved Troy Donahue when he was the golden boy. We barely noticed when he was struggling, and then we remembered him again when it was safe to fold his image into nostalgia. Fame has a way of turning a person into a product, and then into a headline. Maybe the real test isn't whether a star falls, but whether we learn anything when they do. When the lights go out and the crowd goes home, what kind of audience are we, spectators of a collapse, or witnesses willing to ask for better from the industry and from ourselves? The next time we celebrate a perfect image, remember, someone still has to live inside it. Picking up right where we left off, let's slow the story down and line up the turning points, not just as dates on a calendar, but as cause and effect. A life doesn't fall apart in one dramatic blow. It comes undone by a sequence of choices, pressures, and pivots in the culture that seem harmless in the moment and decisive only in hindsight. In 1936, a boy is born in New York City with a solid middle-class future and a father he idolizes. By 14, that father is gone. ALS does not negotiate, and the absence becomes a permanent room inside the young man's mind. He learns to carry himself with poise. He also learns that numbing pain is faster than resolving it. That contradiction will shadow everything that follows. The first adult break doesn't look like a break at all. It's a near-miss, a serious car wreck just before a critical screen test. He survives, barely, and limps back into an industry that runs on momentum. Fate is one reading. Another is that Hollywood keeps doors cracked for anyone who looks like profit. Enter the agent who doesn't just represent clients. He manufactures them. With a new name, Troy Donahue, our subject isn't merely a man anymore. He's a brand promise wrapped in jawline and hair. In the waning years of the studio system, that kind of packaging still works. What studios cannot control in 1960, they can at least predict. A wholesome face will sell to teens relieved to dream of something sunny in a decade already growing turbulent. Now the throttle opens. A summer place becomes the postcard memory. The TV contracts roll in, and the mailroom chokes with letters. That mountain of fan mail isn't just flattery. It is data. Executives see it as market validation, publicists as oxygen, and the actor if he's honest as the start of a trap. Because once you prove you can bring in a very specific demographic, the system will keep you there. Any attempt to stretch beyond that box is treated as a risk to the cash flow. You are not the protagonist of your career. You are an asset class with legs. Culture moves, though, and the system that crowned him can't freeze the clock. By the mid-60s, America begins trading polished dreamboats for jittery antiheroes. The camera gets closer. Acting shifts from surface to wound. Audiences hungry for grit stop buying the postcard. When Troy tries to pivot roles meant to show edge. Stories that scrape rather than sparkle, the audience stays home. And inside the studio, the calculus is simple. If the new version can outperform the old image, marketing money goes elsewhere. The irony is that his attempt to evolve is exactly what critics claim stars never do. And yet when he does it, he is punished by a public that wanted transformation as long as it didn't cost them the comfort of the old fantasy. Personal life and public life begin to blur the way they always do for people whose work is their face. Fast marriages burn hot and ash quickly. Allegations surface, some whispered, some reported about volatility and harm. In another era, these flashpoints might have detonated a career on impact. In that era, the reflex is often containment. Keep the scandal off the front page. Protect the property value. Move the production schedule along. If there is accountability, it tends to be private, partial, or postponed. None of that undoes the damage to people in the blast radius. And it doesn't help the actor get better. What it does is buy time for everyone on the payroll while the audience remains largely unaware. The financial crash in 1968 is both literal and symbolic. Bankruptcy means the image is no longer generating enough revenue to sustain the machine. It also means the actor now meets the same bills as everyone else, minus the buffers. A USO appearance in a war zone that divides the country produces its own turbulence. The industry reads all this not as chapters in a human life, but as risk indicators. Insurance goes up. Willingness to cast goes down. And then comes the image that will haunt the narrative forever. Months sleeping rough in Central Park. There is a blunt moral people like to attach to that fall. Hubris meets gravity, but that neat sentence ignores the more complicated truth that self-destruction and neglect often braid together so tightly you can't tell where one ends and the other begins. The late 60s into early 70s are also when Hollywood itself resets. The old gatekeepers weaken. A new generation of directors arrives with different appetites, messier protagonists, moral gray zones, faces that look lived in. That evolution could have been an opening. Instead, for Troy, it's a reminder that reinvention requires more than a haircut and a grittier script. It requires trust. Directors have to believe you can deliver something they can't get from a dozen hungrier unknowns. Casting is a referendum on memory. Do they remember the pretty poster kid? Or do they remember the work? This is why the phone call from Francis Ford Coppola matters far beyond the size of the role. It is someone with institutional credibility saying, "I can see you in this frame," being credited under his given name. Merle Johnson reads like a small rescue mission, one human being pulling another back from being nothing but an archive photo. The paycheck is meaningful, but the symbolic repair is more important. He is no longer only the ghost of a former marketing strategy. He is a working actor again, if only for a moment. And yet, candidly, one generous role does not erase a decade of drift. The call sheet still slows. Typecasting still stalks. Nostalgia offers cameos, not a second act. The pivot that does hold is sobriety. In the early 80s, He enters a room where fame doesn't mean a thing and the only currency is honesty. 19 years is not a headline. It is a daily practice. That quiet discipline does what the industry could not. It gives him a stable floor. He rebuilds relationships, reconciles where he can, stops adding new damage to old wounds. The final years look normal from the outside: small roles, simple routines, fewer headlines, and that normalcy is the victory. When heart attacks finally close the story, the obituaries remember the golden hair first, because that's how the public file is organized. But the human result of the timeline is simpler: a man who was once consumed by a system and his own habits managed, before the end, to reclaim some measure of peace. If you map these events in strict order, the pattern is plain. Early loss installs a vulnerability. The machine exploits the surface without nourishing the core. Attempts to evolve collide with an audience that confuses familiarity for quality. Personal damage compounds. Institutions choose brand protection over candor. A fall that could have been interrupted becomes a spectacle no one wants to own. Only when the noise recedes does repair begin. We like to say time heals, but it's more accurate to say time gives space if the person grabs it'o do the healing themselves. And that, in a way, is the only part of this timeline that couldn't be outsourced, packaged, or spun by anyone else. Start with the architect of the image, the agent. In mid-century Hollywood, a top agent didn't just negotiate deals. He manufactured identities. A new name isn't a stage flourish, it's a business plan. Troy Donahue sounds like blue sky, clean beaches, and safe romance. That branding locked him into a promise the market could recognize from across a newsstand. But that same promise limited the roles he could credibly pursue. The advantage is obvious: accelerated access to casting rooms, publicity budgets, and a ready-made fan pipeline. The cost is subtler once the product works. The product can't change. If the man underneath needs to evolve, he is people doth brand resists. Because the brand was optimized for yesterday's appetite. The agent's success therefore becomes the actor's cage. Even when both men want the same thing, longevity. Then comes the studio, Warner, in this case the place where packaging meets capital. A studio is a paradox. It can launch a career with one phone call, and it can shrink that same career to silence with none at all. In practical terms, studios allocate three currencies: money, marketing, and mercy. Money gets you on set. Marketing gets you into homes. Mercy is what keeps a bad week from becoming a bad year. When a star is ascendant, all three flow. When numbers dip, money tightens. Marketing shifts to the next bright object, and mercy turns into risk management. That's when handling replaces honesty. Ugly incidents are smoothed over, not to heal anyone, but to keep the machine on schedule. People call this loyalty. It's not. It's asset protection. And when the balance sheet says the asset's value is falling, protection ends. Orbiting that sun is publicity: the old gossip columns, the fan magazines, the soft focus photo spreads. Publicists in that era curated a parallel reality where every date looked wholesome. Every disagreement was a creative difference, and every stumble could be framed as charming. This ecosystem measured success not only by box office, but by inches of flattering copy. It amplified the adoration. 7,000 letters a week doesn't sort itself. And it insulated the actor from criticism until the insulation tore. The downside is predictable. Fame becomes an echo chamber where the loudest sound is the marketing plan talking back to itself. The person at the center hears it too and begins to confuse applause with evidence. Co-stars and romantic partners had their own complicated roles in this economy. On screen, pairing a reliable dreamboat with the right ingenue was a multiplier. Off-screen, fast marriages, fast splits, and rumors created heat that sold magazines until the heat scorched reputations. When allegations of volatility or harm surface, the system's first impulse is containment, negotiate, hush, pivot. For those harmed, that strategy compounds the injury and delays accountability. For the actor, it postpones the reckoning he needs to change. The public is told as little as possible for as long as possible, because the public's knowledge is a liability line. By the time the truth leaks, everyone is already tired, and fatigue gets mistaken for forgiveness. There are outliers in this map, individuals who act against the grain of corporate logic. Francis Ford Coppola is one. His decision to offer a small role, credited under the actor's given name, and treat him as a colleague rather than a relic is a quiet rebuke to the disposability built into the system. One director with standing can do what 1,000 kind words cannot: restore professional legitimacy. But we should be clear about the limits of that gesture. A cameo is not a career strategy. It is a bridge back to the craft. Nothing more. Without sustained belief from casting directors, producers, and audiences, the bridge ends in midair. Risk officers and insurers rarely discussed in fan lore also steer careers. When an actor's life looks unstable, premiums rise and completion bonds get tricky. That makes the actor expensive in ways audiences never see. A director may want the performance. A line producer sees a budget that now wobbles. Casting is never only about talent. It is about predictability on a schedule built to the hour. The cruel irony: when someone needs the stability of work most, the spreadsheet punishes the very instability that work could help repair. And then there is the audience, often described as a monolith, but in reality a shifting coalition of taste, nostalgia, and boredom. The audience created the demand for a sunlit poster boy, then asked the industry to serve a different meal: ambiguity, bite, realism. None of that is wrong. Tastes evolve. The question is what we reward in the transition. Do we reward artistic risk from familiar faces? Or do we prefer to crown new ones and retire the old with a wink? When we cheer a train wreck headline and scroll past a quiet year of sobriety, we communicate to everyone in the system: stars, producers, editors, what stories sell. The culture responds accordingly. One institution in this story resists the gravity of spectacle: the recovery room. In those spaces, no one cares about your billing. The rules are plain: tell the truth, show up, and don't drink today. 19 years of that discipline reintroduced boundaries. The business had erased privacy that isn't a PR strategy, accountability that isn't a press release, repairs that aren't content. It's easy to dismiss such rooms as footnotes because they don't produce dramatic images. But if you're mapping forces, they matter because they are the first rooms in which the man is not a product. Family belongs on the map too, even if it enters late. Reconnecting with children, building a steady partnership, and choosing smaller, steadier routines counters the narrative gravitational pull toward extreme meteors and craters. The industry rarely values that chapter. Audiences rarely see it. Yet, for the person living the life, that boring stability is the whole point of surviving the earlier chapters. It is proof that the story can be more than an autopsy of youth. Put all these actors together: the agent who minted a brand, the studio that financed its rise and priced its fall, the publicists who painted over the cracks, the press that sold both the fantasy and the collapse, the directors who remembered him as a colleague and not a cartoon, the insurers who measured risk in dollars per day, the recovery rooms that measured progress in days sober, the family who measured love in ordinary time. And you get a system that explains the arc without needing a single cartoon villain. Responsibility is not a pie chart to be divided once. It is a web in which every strand tugged either tightens the net or gives someone a path out. The hard part is admitting that a career can be both a personal story and a corporate artifact, and that the distance between those two realities is exactly where a human being can get lost. With the power map in view, let's press on the seams, the places where this story doesn't sit comfortably, where simple narratives get shaky. These are the unanswered questions and contradictions that turn a biography into an X-ray of an industry. They don't exist to absolve or to condemn. They exist to test how we think about accountability, myth-making, and the costs hidden behind a glossy poster. Start with the most obvious friction: beauty versus merit. Was Troy elevated because he was a singular talent waiting to be discovered, or because his face fit a market slot that studios had already priced? It's too easy to say both. So let's get practical. In a system that measured success by mailbags and matinees, a photogenic 20-something could out-earn a nuanced 30-something without breaking a sweat. That isn't a moral failing by itself. It's a market signal. The problem is what followed. Once the market fell in love with the surface, the system had little incentive to fund the depth. Acting classes, script risks, and directors who demand more take time and trust. Why invest in slow growth when the fast product is printing money? By the time culture turned and demanded complexity, the very conditioning that made him bankable had also left him underprepared for the new aesthetic. Is that his fault? Partly. Is that the machine's fault? Also partly. Shared responsibility is unsatisfying, but it's honest. Then there's the darker knot: alleged harm and studio containment. When power brokers deflect or muffle accusations to keep a release slate on track, we enter the zone where public relations substitutes for moral reasoning. The question isn't only, did they protect the star? It's, whom did they fail to protect by doing so? Corporations talk about duty of care. What they often mean is duty to shareholder value. Non-disclosure agreements, choreographed statements, and pressure to move on can buy a quarter's peace while borrowing against the future, because sooner or later the truth leaks, and then everyone pays with interest. If an incident is managed instead of addressed, the actor avoids immediate consequence. Yes, but he also loses the jolt that might have forced change sooner. Meanwhile, people around him carry injuries the audience never sees. Efficiency becomes complicity, and the ledger never balances clean. Consider the homelessness chapter. Public memory loves extremes. So the image of a one-time idol sleeping in a city park gets used as a neat moral teaching aid. Pride goes before the fall. But that neatness can slide into exploitation. How long was he on the street? How precarious were the months before and after? Was there outreach that almost worked? We rarely ask, because 6 months in the park photographs better than 2 years of couch surfing and near misses. The first is a headline. The second is a social failure, with many authors' friends who pulled away, managers who ran out of leverage, an industry without a safety net for its broken tools. If we only cite the bench, we risk reducing a complicated spiral to a meme and learning nothing about prevention. Now the USO detour, a publicity mission into a war that was tearing the country in two. You don't need a grand scandal to create fallout. You only need a mismatch between expectation and reality. A star trained to deliver light entertainment walked into a geopolitical grinder where the audience wasn't buying fantasy. Even a small misstep becomes a symbol, and symbols are heavy. From a distance, this reads like a footnote. Up close, it's a moment where career management collided with national trauma, and almost any outcome would have been wrong for someone. It's a reminder that stars are often sent as ambassadors for moods their handlers haven't measured correctly. What about the bridge back? The Godfather Part 2 credit under his birth name? Charitable rescue, meta joke, or creative judgment? The honest answer is that it can be all three at once. Directors are human. They carry memories, loyalties, and winks to those in the know. They are also professionals who protect the integrity of their films. A tiny role lets a filmmaker honor a past connection without gambling the movie. The industry likes to romanticize moments like this because they hint at a community more generous than its balance sheets. The reality is subtler. An act of grace created space for work, but it could not substitute for a sustained re-education of the audience or the craftspeople who didn't yet trust him with harder material. Recovery introduces another paradox. 19 sober years is a towering achievement. Yet the press economy is calibrated to cover relapses, not routines. Stability doesn't trend. Disasters do. So the chapter that likely required the most daily courage became the least reported. That editorial bias shapes public memory. We remember the fall because it makes noise. We forget the repair because it is quiet. If the goal is to understand a person rather than harvest a spectacle, we have to adjust our own appetites. Ask to hear from the people who saw him show up. Make amends. Keep promises. Those accounts rarely become headlines, but they are the only ones that tell you whether the ending was earned. Memory itself is an unreliable narrator. Obituaries clean up timelines. Nostalgia sands off splinters. Fans who once screamed at fences will later tell you they always knew he was more than a pretty face, because that's kinder to remember. Critics who dismissed him as hollow will claim foresight when the culture pivoted, because that's how authority sustains itself. Both moves are human. Both distort. The responsible way to reread the past is to accept how inconsistent our judgments were in real time. We were drawn to the light. We got bored. We turned away. We looked back only when it was safe to be sentimental. There are counterfactuals worth testing. What if an early mentor had insisted on theater seasons between films to stretch his instrument? What if a studio had risked rebranding him steadily over 5 years instead of flipping a switch and abandoning the attempt when opening weekend sagged? What if accountability for harm had arrived earlier, forcing real repair while he still had leverage to use? None of these hypotheticals absolve personal choices. They simply remind us that systems can be designed to catch people before gravity does all the work. Which brings us to a present-day lens. Would this story play out differently now? In some ways, yes. Social media would magnify both the ascent and the implosion. Receipts would surface faster. Containment would be harder. There are also more off-ramps, mental health clauses, coaches who specialize in transitions, a broader range of roles for aging faces. But algorithms are just new studios with fewer adults in the room. They will still sell what spikes engagement. And collapse still spikes better than recovery. If we don't change what we click, we shouldn't pretend we've changed how the machines behave. At the center of these tensions is a hard boundary we keep trying to blur: the difference between explanation and excuse. Childhood loss explains a vulnerability. It does not excuse harm. A predatory publicity economy explains secrecy. It does not excuse cover-ups. An audience's fickleness explains why studios pivot. It does not excuse abandoning basic duty of care. If we can hold those lines clearly, calmly, we can talk about human failure and corporate failure in the same breath without turning either into a cartoon. And if we can do that, then this story stops being a relic from a sepia decade and starts functioning as a mirror. In Troy's early ascent, the delivery system was tactile and slow. Fan magazines stacked at drugstores. Radio DJs reading breathless copy. TV variety shows staging easy smiles under warm lights. Those outlets trained us to read a handsome face as moral shorthand. If the close-up sparkled, the story didn't have to. Fan mail functioned as a primitive engagement metric, shoeboxes of letters interpreted as proof that a promise was working. Editors leaned into a tone that made readers feel protective and a little possessive. That's parasocial attachment in its early form. Millions of people building a one-way intimacy through curated fragments. 3 quotes. 2 photos. and an anecdote polished by a publicist. When the machine later tried to shift the audience toward edgier material, it discovered the cost of its own conditioning. We had been trained to want comfort from this face. We punished the product for changing recipes. By the early 1970s, a different chorus rose, critics and cineasts pushing for ambiguity and moral friction. Review pages rewarded broken heroes and street-level realism. The press became less patient with packaged wholesomeness. But the same headlines that praised serious art also sharpened the appetite for spectacle when a star stumbled. Two media instincts collided: elevate craft and monetize chaos, and the second pays faster. The tabloid economy learned to stage public morality plays, set the golden boy up as an emblem, then break the emblem and sell the shards. In that framework, any rumor of volatility around Troy didn't land on a blank page. It landed on a template already sketched, too pretty to be real, too messy to be trusted. Narratives stick when they rhyme with our prior beliefs. The 1990s added a soft focus rebound, cable reruns, nostalgia specials. And where are they now? Columns offered a gentler rewrite. Viewers who had aged into mortgages and PDA meetings were open to kinder memories of their own youth. The industry obliged by packaging yesterday as a safer country. The hair was better. The problems were smaller. The stars were sweeter. Obituaries later sealed that version with selective chronology. We tell ourselves we are honoring the dead. Often we are editing the discomfort out of our own past consumption. That's not cynicism. It's an observation about how memory serves the present. Now jump to today's media logics. Not to anachronistically drag Troy onto platforms he never used, but to expose the continuity algorithms came to do. At warp speed, what studios and editors did by hand, amplify patterns that keep eyes from blinking. A 10-second collapse outperforms a 2-year rebuild because panic outruns patience. Cancel and redemption aren't moral processes online. They're traffic shapes. The crowd is still a coalition of moods, but the feedback loop is instantaneous and relentless. If we reward humiliations with clicks and speed past nuance, the system learns to deliver more humiliations. The machine doesn't hate anyone. It is simply obedient. You can see this dynamic in the language we adopt. Labels are memory zip files: dreamboat, washed up, bad boy, comeback. Each compresses a life into one word, which then travels faster than any correction. Agenda-setting theory explains the rest. The press doesn't dictate what to think, but it does nudge what to think about. If every mention of a name sits next to collapse, collapse becomes the lens. Framing does the finer work. It decides whether a rough week is a spiral or a course correction, whether an allegation demands attention or deserves a sidebar. The crowd repeats the shorthand, because shorthand saves time. Before long, the shorthand replaces the person. The audience's role is complicated by two opposing forces: compassion fatigue and outrage drift. Compassion fatigue makes us numb to long, quiet efforts at repair. Outrage drift pulls us toward the next cliff-edge moment. Together, they create an attention valley where the middle chapter's therapy, amends, ordinary work barely register. Yet those chapters determine whether an ending has dignity. If you judge a life by the headlines alone, you'll always miss the change that happens after editors lose interest. That's why survivors often insist on a different archive. Testimonials from people who saw the day in, day out work. Those accounts don't spike. They accumulate. They are also the least likely to be algorithmically promoted. There's another distortion worth naming: the spiral of silence. In any era, when a dominant narrative hardens, say, he was all surface, no substance. Dissenting voices, co-workers who saw craft, friends who saw growth go quiet rather than invite blowback. The silence then looks like consensus. and consensus hardens into truth. Only when the temperature drops off and after a death do we hear cooler accounts. By then, it's too late to influence casting decisions or redirect a career. The public conversation lagged reality, and the lag functioned as a sentence. So what does a more responsible media posture look like when covering a figure like Troy? First, timebox speculation and label it. Treat rumors as claims to be weighed, not content to be fed. Second, widen the aperture of sources, not just publicists and adversaries, but colleagues from sets where the person showed up and delivered. Third, separate explanation from absolution in plain language. Audiences over 45, especially, don't need euphemism. They need clarity that respects their intelligence. Fourth, adopt a to-archive mindset. What the headlines captured and what the people who actually worked with him remember. Where those archives agree, you likely have the spine of the truth. Where they diverge, that gap is the story. There's also a role for audiences beyond media literacy talking points. We can stop conflating our nostalgia with an entitlement to simplicity. We can resist the reflex to treat a star's worst week as our entertainment and their best year as boring. We can notice when a platform's design is training us to be unkind, and make micro-decisions lingering on a long-form interview instead of a dunk clip that send a different signal. None of that turns us into saints, and it won't fix the whole economy of attention, but it does remove the alibi that the system made me do it. Systems respond to appetite. Appetite is personal. Finally, it helps to name the stakes without melodrama. Public narratives shape private options. If a person is reduced to a punchline, their odds of receiving fair consideration in rooms that matter casting, insurance, even a straightforward apology drops sharply. If the story updates to include credible change, their range of futures widens a little. Troy's arc, told poorly, becomes a fable about pretty faces and inevitable ruin. Told carefully, it becomes a study in how culture can trap a man in a decade and how a man, quietly, can outgrow the trap long after the applause has stopped. Having traced the crowd and the megaphone, we're left with one last task: to read this story in the present tense and ask what it teaches without turning it into a sermon. The value of revisiting a life like Troy Donahue's isn't nostalgia. It's pattern recognition. If we can see the pattern clearly, how a marketable image outruns a developing craft, how institutions prioritize silence over repair, how audiences reward the dramatic slide more than the steady climb back, then maybe we can nudge the next version of this story onto a different track. Start with the ledger of responsibility. There are 3 columns worth keeping in view. In the first are personal choices, the drinking that dulled pain but also dulled judgment, the volatility that damaged trust, the denial that delayed change. In the second are corporate decisions, the packaging that froze a young actor in a profitable pose, the crisis playbooks that prized containment, the budget math that made him too risky to ensure when he most needed work to stabilize. In the third is public appetite, our willingness to keep buying the polished myth, then to feast on the collapse, and finally to ask for soft, focused tributes that rescue our memories from discomfort. These columns don't cancel each other. They coexist. If you erase any one, you end up with a fairy tale, a hit piece, or a eulogy. None of those help. From that ledger, you can draw some practical guardrails, nothing grand, just course corrections that accumulate. Agents and managers can think in arcs instead of spikes, building in intervals where the image rests and the skill is forced to grow. Theater seasons, acting classes no one tweets about, roles that risk disappointment on purpose. Studios can separate PR containment from duty of care if harm is alleged. Treat the safety of people as non-negotiable, even if it slows a release. Publicists can retire the reflex to sell stability as boring by coaching clients and editors to value the unphotogenic middle chapters that make the third act possible. Insurers and producers can adjust their calculus to recognize that sometimes a small investment in support reduces volatility more than a large penalty ever will. The press isn't the villain here, but it is the narrator most of us hear. A more honest narration would admit when it's framing rather than finding, show its sources as a range instead of a choir, and keep two archives open at once: the record of headlines and the record of people who actually worked with the person after the spotlight cooled. When those archives align, you have shape. When they diverge, you have the real work of journalism. Explain why, without using the gap as gasoline. Audiences, people like us, shave fewer levers, but they aren't imaginary. Attention is a currency, and we spend it every day. You don't have to be pious about what you click, only mindful. If the economy of attention is designed to amplify chaos, then lingering on long-form interviews, choosing context over snark, and refusing to share clips that flatten a life into a taunt are small acts with cumulative weight. We can also resist the temptation to rewrite our own past reactions as wisdom. It's fine to admit we love the poster and miss the person. Owning that lapse is better than pretending we saw the whole picture all along. There's also a quieter principle, one that applies inside any workplace, but is often missing in entertainment: build exits before you need them. For a young star, that means mentors who will tell you what to do when the crowd stops clapping, and contracts that anticipate career pivots instead of treating them as betrayals. For companies, it means codifying processes that don't rely on one powerful person's discretion when ethics collide with profit. For the person struggling with addiction, it means a map of rooms where headlines don't matter and honesty does. None of this makes a story drama-proof. It makes it survivable. Reframing Troy's arc through three lenses can help keep the analysis balanced. Through the myth lens, he's the golden boy who proved that beauty without depth is a time bomb. That reading is tidy and sells well, but it's thin. Through the systemic lens, he's a case study in how mid-century Hollywood monetized a face, managed scandal, and discarded a man when the margins tighten. Need a critique that still applies in today's algorithmic economy. That reading is sharper, but it risks turning him into a symbol with no agency. Through the human lens, he's a flawed person who did real harm and real repair, who failed publicly and succeeded quietly, and who finished with 19 sober years that never made much noise. That reading isn't cinematic. It is, however, the closest to truth. The tension points remain. Explanation is not excuse, but it is the beginning of understanding. Forgiveness and forgetting are not synonyms. One clears a path forward. The other erases what must be remembered to avoid repetition. Accountability does not require annihilation. It requires accuracy, proportion, and the courage to hold a line when fan sentiment or market logic wants shortcuts. If we can keep those distinctions straight, a story like this becomes less of a ritual sacrifice and more of a manual. Try a few counterfactuals to rewrite the past, but to test the machinery. Imagine a version of the 60s where a studio budgets time for Troy to vanish into repertory theater between films, not as punishment, but as policy. Imagine a 70s in which early, public accountability for harm forces real amends and creates boundaries, rather than hush agreements that buy time and sell out the future. Imagine an 80s where the industry recognizes sobriety not as a publicity angle, but as a working condition that deserves the same logistical respect as a complex stunt. None of those moves make headlines. They do, however, change trajectories. What, then, should we carry forward? A skepticism about any narrative that collapses a person to a headline. A preference for timelines over impressions. A willingness to talk about damage without weaponizing it. and about repair without romanticizing it, and understanding that career management is hollow if it does not include the parts of a life the camera never sees. And maybe a simple bias for the unglamorous work showing up, apologizing correctly, doing the thing again tomorrow that determines whether a late chapter reads like grace or like denial. If you strip away the poster gloss and the tabloid noise, you're left with a man who started with an advantage he didn't fully know how to use. A system that exploited that advantage until it broke. A public that fell in love with the surface and grew bored when the surface cracked. And a final stretch in which he traded spectacle for sobriety. That trade is not the stuff of legends. It is the stuff of adulthood. It doesn't fix what came before. And it doesn't demand applause. It simply refuses a final collapse. So when another perfectly lit face arrives, and the old machinery starts humming agents with a plan, studios with a slot, platforms with an algorithm, maybe we ask a few unbeautiful questions at the beginning. What muscle sits under that image? What supports are in place when the first storm hits? Who is empowered to say stop when the calendar says go? And when the fall begins, as falls tend to do, will anyone with real leverage do more than stage manage the noise? The answers won't rescue every story, but they might keep one person from becoming another cautionary montage we watch with the sound turned low, telling ourselves we've learned, while the same machine readies the next act. Here's a powerful, open-ended conclusion in American English, written to linger more than it lectures. When a person becomes a product and the product becomes a headline, something essential disappears in the glare. Maybe the question isn't whether a star rises or falls, but what we choose to see while it's happening and what we refuse to see until it's too late. We can keep applauding the image, or we can ask harder things of the industry, of the press, and of ourselves. Where is the line between explanation and excuse? How do we hold people accountable without turning them into content? And when the noise fades, what kind of audience do we want to have been bystanders to a collapse? Or witnesses who learned enough to change the next story? There isn't a tidy moral here. Only a map. Talent without support warps. Systems without ethics corrode. And crowds without memory repeat the same mistakes. If there's a lesson worth carrying home, it's deceptively simple: slow down your judgment. Widen your sources. And remember that the quiet work of repair rarely trends, but often decides the ending. The next time a flawless image is placed in front of us, let's ask what muscles and safeguards live beneath it and whether we're willing to reward those, even when they aren't photogenic. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. Subscribe to Tragedy Uncovered so you won't miss any hidden truths. Goodbye, and see you next time.